I'm going to give a talk on what I call the designs for the Biocene, with an intention to look for what might happen in a certain age of the Anthropocene. As we all know, the Anthropocene hasn't been really accepted, but I think we all understand and realize that the anthropogenic legacy is huge, and there's clearly something that might not be called the Anthropocene, but it's something along those lines. So the Biocene is an intention to see something beyond that, where the core of our systems will be biological and not mechanical and just digital. As Sanjay has said, I have a studio called Studio Biocene. This is an interdisciplinary research-led practice. So what we do is we do a set of projects where, for us, the scale is not so much the important thing. What matters is that there is an intention to bring biological systems into architecture. And I'm a deep believer that it's in this interdisciplinary field where architecture starts bridging into other areas. So I'm a deep believer that our biological origins are the ones that really need to be taken much more seriously for us to find our way back to where we came from and what we are. And as you can see here on this image, we are a group of people. Brenda Parker and I were the founders of Studio Biocene, but also Harry, who is an ecologist and plant ecologist in the St. Andrews Botanic Gardens. Shneel Malik is actually originally from India and lives between India and London. Nina Jotanovic is in Serbia and also in London, and Nav Gill is also in London and Dubai. And that's how we have come together with a set of different expertise, which feeds into a research group that we have and also a master's program at the Bartlett at University College London, which is called Biointegrated Design. Brenda and I, again, we started this in 2018 and thought that architecture and biochemical engineering should somehow come together to figure out new materials, new systems of thinking. And this was actually just a photograph that we had in the opening of our exhibition just very recently, where we have around 45 students. That includes also some PhD students who we work with. So the practice is really sort of Studio Biocene and biointegrated design. They work very much in tandem with each other. Now, just about my origin and my sort of lineage, where I come from, I was part with Peter Cook and Colin Fournier, part of this competition team that did Kunsthaus Graz. And for me, it's very important, sort of the lineage of the organicism in architecture, almost as a statement against the excessively rationalized line of architecture that has been in the tendency much more conservative. And I think there's a very fundamental line, at least in Western architecture, where organicism has looked for completely different results, much more experimental architecture. And here you can see with my colleague Marian Coletti, we had a practice for many years where we were doing lots of exhibition installations and smaller constructions, which were for us used to push the boundaries of innovation. Every time we designed one piece, it was to do with how the machining of this piece was done, how we could optimize and improvise, but also make the work expressive and create the level of empathy of the users and the pieces that we were doing. I'm very interested in the relationship between the low tech and the high tech. I work in a very high tech environment, but I'm aware that in the world, we don't have the high tech everywhere. We need to figure out how to bring low tech systems into high tech systems and vice versa. So this was a project that Marin and I did years ago in Lisbon for the book fair. And it was a very, very cheap, quick construction, but nonetheless, it was the main pavilion for the book fair. and it had to have sort of the qualities of something that was built with more means. Now, this was a bit the opposite. This was actually a very high-tech piece we'd built for the London Olympics, where we worked with different relationships between nature and the design of the architecture. This was a sort of double corten steel perforated structure, which had never been done before. We worked with Austrian engineers and German manufacturers to create something that had never been built, a little folly in the park. And finally, also a piece of work we designed for Taipei a few years ago, where the idea was not only to create a set of towers, but actually to create these towers almost like tree barks, where you have the water runoffs creating a continuum of growth so that the park and the buildings were sort of gradually brought together into a continuum. Now, one of my favorite architects is Bruce Goff. I don't know if he's a reference in India, but Bruce Goff was a sort of an extraordinarily creative architect in the mid-20th century. And he lived in the Midwest of America and built tons of houses and buildings. And he was also the director of the architecture school of Oklahoma. And I just read this quote that is from a lecture that he gave in 1953 in Oklahoma. And the lecture was about the new and different in architecture. And he says, what is the good of thinking of things that you can't do? I think for one thing, it makes you realize that what you're doing is in a very primitive stage. This is not a healthy feeling if we think of it as a handicap. If we can't think of it as a sign that we are young and growing, not at the end of an epoch, but at the beginning of one, then I think this is exciting. And I take this statement that Bruce Goff made very seriously. I think we are at the beginning of an epoch. We are not at the end of something, as the doom loop that we are sort of involved in is trying to argue. So I'm very keen to push ideas further so that we have a new response to the crisis that we are in. Now, I spoke about the anthropogenic legacy. We all know what we have and what we are producing. And this is the skyline of Mumbai, a place closer to you than to me. But what is happening here is that rather than looking at the disastrous impact that it has on the environment, I have been thinking in a slightly different way. And that is that we have added to the world's surface an enormous amount of area, surface area, that we currently we do not make use of. In fact, in geography, you calculate the size of countries always according to what topographically exists. But nobody has really done a calculation of how much surface area our cities have actually added to the world surface. So I did a little exercise where I looked in London at a set of buildings to understand how much more surface area they had than their footprint. And for instance, a small-scale housing typology, a Victorian terrace in London has around 3 times, a bit more than 3 times of facade roof area than its footprint. And that's not including all the ornamentation and the little decorations that are there. If you go to a mid-sized building, for instance, the Camden Town Hall, you would have over 6 times the surface area. When you get to a large skyscraper like the Shard, you would have over 18 times the surface area. In other words, if I go back to this image of Mumbai, I could imagine with these skyscrapers that we have here, that if we flatten the surface area, we have a much larger area to deal with that could be, in fact, between 10 and 20 times bigger than what we're currently considering. Now, what that means is that we have an opportunity here. And we know the impact we're having on the biodiversity loss through the climate crisis and all the activity we have, the pollution. But there are also other ways to look at this. Now, Oliver Gilbert was an English lichenologist, and he spent a lot of time going around the UK and looking at churchyards and found out that there are lichen species that are unique to these churchyards that have mutated and developed to adjust to the environmental conditions and material conditions of these churches and these spaces around them. In other words, the speciation has happened in natural terms in a very fast manner around what we have built. For instance, in the old cathedral, in the medieval cathedral in Coimbra in central Portugal, there is a bacteria and then a fungi that has developed that doesn't exist anywhere else, that is specific to this interior of this cathedral. And then Mark Medovnik, a colleague here at UCL, just recently showed this image on Instagram, which I found was very, very important, which is this hornet's nest, where the hornets have cannibalized basically a fabric and created their nest and have used the yarns and build them into what their nest is. Now that shows in different ways how nature has used what we have done, adjusted, and integrated into what animals, plants actually are doing. Now, there is another thing that for me is very, very important, and that is what you can see on the screen right now, which is the capacity that certain species have to adjust to the environment by absorbing water and releasing water very fast without dying, and that's what is called poikilohydry. So you can see here the lichens absorbing a bit of water. They work dry for large periods of time, but then they have this response to immediately increasing, becoming photosynthetic and growing. Now, if you think poikilohydry doesn't need any artificial irrigation, the plants are capable to just adjust and switch on and off. And that, for me, is a very important way of thinking, because that means that we don't have to irrigate in a laborious manner, in a costly manner, what we actually are growing around us. This led me to another conceptual shift, and it is after spending 7 years doing my PhD, which was very focused on notions of skin. The skin as being sort of the most important metaphor we use in architecture. You know, every building has a sort of fancy skin, but the skin has, in Western tradition, roots in the bourgeois understanding of 18th century skin, 18th, 19th century skin, which is a female skin that is, in its tendency, thin, it's quite pure, and has a sense of membrane condition. And Adrian Forty, the historian, has once written a little article where he questioned that. He said there is no equivalent currently in our language, in our terminology and jargon we use in architecture, where we talk about the thick skin, something that has a three-dimensionality and in fact can even change. And for me, the strongest equivalent would be the notion of the bark. And that is that the bark is more of a host. It's a very three-dimensional condition. It's very varied. It's heterogeneous. It changes in time throughout the seasons. And what it has is this capacity to have growth on it without affecting the performance of the tree. So if we start thinking about tree barks and architectural barks, maybe that is a much more appropriate and interesting term than thinking about architectural skins. One more thing that I find incredibly important is the role of microbial consortia. In the sciences, we are used to the monocultures of species, because that's what in scientific circles we need to focus on one species to understand it and work in exclusion of others. But in fact, in nature, everything is part of a consortium. It's the relationship between the species that is very badly understood that really matters. So this small scale, the very tiny small scale, has a phenomenal impact on everything we do. We know that now. We had, even the experience of the pandemic has shown us that a virus can change the entirety of the world. And we know that the microbiome has the same power. So I've been actually spending quite a bit of time zooming in rather than necessarily zooming out, in order from zooming in, being able to understand what happens on a smaller scale. And here we see moss growing in some of the materials that we have set up, where you can see that in a very fast and quick manner, these microbial consortia, they can take over the materials. And we might not see it with our eye, but they are growing. Everything is covered with a cryptogamic surface cover. So it's fascinating to understand that what is small has then an impact on everything else on a larger scale. Now, as you can imagine, growth on buildings is not something that everybody likes. In fact, in the UK, there's, for instance, a company called Oxcrete. I don't know exactly, what they meant by that. I mean, I know it's from Oxford, but Oxcrete is a way to get rid of moss from concrete. And I find this hilarious because this almost steps into the 20th century tradition of we want the purity of our materials. We don't want anything to grow on it. It implies that there might be some damage. In fact, we need to go back to Romanticism to understand that, at least Western Romanticism of the 19th century, where the relationship between nature and what we have built was seen as high level. And in fact, still nowadays, when you want to buy figural ornaments or any components for your gardens, if you buy them new, they will have a value. If you buy them aged, they have a much higher value. And they are full of patchy stuff and irregular stuff growing on it, but we do accept it as being high level. So in other words, I come back to the point that Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, made, and that it's all about matter out of place. If we see things in place, which we consider in place, and we design for having growth, then we will find it exciting. If we haven't designed for it to have any growth, then we will see whatever happens there as matter out of place and a problem. But I find that we are currently in what I call a period of impure aesthetics. The aesthetics of hygiene of the 20th century are over. We are clearly embracing a sense of impurity and imperfection that we know our world and we ourselves as humans are about. And our buildings need to reflect that type of aesthetic relationship. Now, we know in the 20th century that the modernist dream was a very different one. And it had an impact not only architecturally, but in terms of the entirety of our landscape that became manicured. And still today, when you drive around, and I take a train here in the UK, I look at the landscape and it's entirely manicured. It's entirely made up. And it's the crisis of lack of biodiversity is tremendous. The UK is one of the worst affected countries in the world by pesticides and the whole management that has happened since the Victorian times of our landscape. And that's what is causing the biggest crisis we are in. So we will clearly need to look beyond this. We need to take this framed view of nature somewhere out there, and we believing that it's all nice and beautiful, and we need to bring it closer. We need to integrate. I don't know if this is something that in India is currently a big topic, but here in the UK, and I know in America as well, the notion of the meanwhile garden means the space in transition is of great importance. We are looking a lot at meanwhile sites, the ones that once had buildings where humans have made a mess and then they left something behind. But in fact, the response that nature is having is very interesting. The author, Emma Maris, called it rambunctious garden. The notion that there is this messy stuff left behind, but there is an enormous value in starting to look at more carefully and actually working with the vegetation and the plants that grow here. We did in Studio Bioscene a project called garden anthromes, where we used robots to do impact printing and create a set of planters that we are gradually letting erode in the landscape. And it's a response to water and moisture retention and a certain amount of growth that is happening around in this meanwhile garden. The idea that we're starting to work with the soil that we encounter rather than importing everything from outside. Now, this is an ongoing topic. And I mentioned the microbiome. We did a project called the Biocene Garden, where the core of this idea is to bring the microbiome into the consciousness, but also how the garden evolves. And it's into the consciousness of people. Now, this idea of the microbiome is very difficult because it's on a very small scale that we can't see. So we definitely have to work with biologists and microbiologists who have the ability to understand what is in our soils, what is actually in the microbiome of our soils and on the trees, and how that has an impact of what then these gardens look like. By the way, I'm often asked, what's the typology of the 21st century? If we had the modernists had a focus on the cell, the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, had a focus on the great public buildings, the post offices, the great train stations, etc. Every era has its sort of, core typology. I would say that in order to make an architectural statement today, we need to design a garden. We need to understand what it means to design a garden. And if to design a building is to design a garden, I think we are maybe closer to understand how we might relate to our environment. And then along these lines, we have done recently a project for a house, which we call the Biocene House. And as you might see on the top left-hand side set of small images, there is a sort of series of diagrams. And it's to do with the lineage and how core typologies of houses have evolved from the courtyard house to the distribution of rooms in this contiguous manner inside the house, inside the palaces. Then you have the introduction of the corridor in the late 18th century, 19th century. Then you have the plan libre of Le Corbusier, the appliance house of Allison and Peter Smithlands, which was called the House of the Future, with all these cubicles distributed. And in this line of typological change, we thought that actually what we need is to bring nature and the microbiome into the core of the house. So the house has started to be distributed and these spaces being organized according to these infolds that we have, the villi, basically, that come from the outside and bring and penetrate the house. So you can see from the top, the house is fully penetrated by these spaces, but also the roof and the self-sustainability and sufficiency of the water cycles and the energy becomes a very important aspect of this house. The idea that the house is not dependent on the grid anymore, it has a self-sufficiency and autonomy. Now, I spoke about scale. And for us in the work we do, there's no doubt that we work on 3 different scales simultaneously. In fact, you could add even another scale, a 4th scale, if you work in more urban and on an urban scale. The smallest scale is the scale of the material, is the scale of the biology. It's actually designing the biochemistry of the materials that we want and that we need in the future that stand an alternative to what we currently use. The medium scale is the scale of the bas-relief, of the texture, something that has to do with the quality of the surface. And surfaces do matter hugely for what can grow or not on our buildings. And the third, larger scale is actually of the component, is the more tectonic scale that we have. That, of course, imply then more how do you make and manufacture such components. And as I said, the 4th one could be then the scale of the city when you have a much larger scale. For us, the surface roughness is very important. That is a material usually architecturally is discussed as having a texture. The texture is in fact scientifically a very ambiguous term. It doesn't mean a lot. It just means that the morphology changes slightly. The surface roughness is more specific because it's really to do with how much roughness and porosity is there on the surface of a material. And I like the term bas relief because it's actually coming historically from a condition where we gave a three-dimensionality to our surfaces that are quite flat. And that is creating depth and readability in something that still is built within the constraints of material flatness. I did a lot of studies on morphologies, on surface morphologies, to understand how water runoffs work on them. And the interesting thing is that we have spent many centuries trying to get rid of water. We saw water and the climate as a threat, and therefore we protected ourselves from that threat by creating, the architecture we have around us as a protective measurement. But what we are currently looking at is how to retain water, how to make the most out of this precious material, the most important material we have, without which there's no life. So water runoffs, whether you want to get rid of it or keep it and retain it, really matters. And it's partly to do with what the material surface roughness is and what morphological possibilities and intricacies there are. So what you see here is different geometries in order to start working on these panels and how we might retain water. And more tests, more drawings, some of them becoming actually highly ornamental. And I'm a deep believer that the role of ornamentation needs to be brought back into architecture. We lost it in the 20th century. And we had ornamentation not necessarily as a decor, but the ornamentation is something that is culturally, materially, and structurally ingrained, a level of expression and communication that ornamentation has. But now we have a sort of environmental dimension to the ornamentation, which is to work with geometries that in their own right have patterns and qualities that are really fascinating to work with, that people identify with and have empathy with. We have done a lot of material tests to look at the porosity of materials. In fact, every single material we use is bioreceptive. That means it has the capacity at some point in time to be biocolonized. But we often don't want this bioreceptivity, but it's there. There is no doubt that every single surface we are creating that is exposed to the outdoors will be at some point covered with little species, even if we might not see it. So we have been looking at the notions of aging, of weathering, and how we actually can accelerate some of these processes to integrate them as part of our design. We also looked at different manufacturing processes of how to create these components that are, in fact, hard sponges. They have the capacity to retain the water for longer periods of time and then release the water for the species. Here we did install a set of walls with these panels in a school here in South London, where we transplanted moss onto it and left some of the other ones without moss in order to compare how fast these walls are acquiring and gaining growth on their own. Because the whole point is that they are autonomous and they can grow what we wanted on them. I speak a lot about materials, and as we all know, the construction industry is unbelievably unsustainable. The materials we use to a large extent are fired, and we need to look for alternatives. And the big splash word is what is called engineered living materials. More and more people around the world are trying to engineer these living materials, that is, to create systems where we can grow our materials and avoid the firing process. Now, one of our best ever students is in fact from India, from Assam. He's called Prantar Tamuli. He is just finishing his PhD. There's a patent application for this material that is now covering a lot of countries. And what is amazing is that Prantar with our support, managed to do one thing, which is to not only grow a material very fast, but is actually to control that growth in a three-dimensional manner. And in basic terms, what you're looking at is silica aggregates with some glass fibers as a reinforcement, but to a large extent you have then a matrix of a material where cyanobacteria is growing three-dimensionally and binding these silica particles together. And I will show you a little movie to exemplify.
It is well known that the building industry is the largest carbon emitting industry today. And some of the key reasons are that they are made with materials with high embodied carbon, constructed in a process of discrete assemblies, and designed in an analytical but top down manner. And in this project, we not only want to propose solutions to these issues, but provoke a radically alternative possibility. We believe that the buildings of our future are living entities, biologically alive, physically intelligent, and ecologically regenerative. And the only questions are, what will it be made of, how will it be grown, and what will be its form? We are trying to answer these questions by driving research and innovation in three separate frontiers simultaneously: biochemical engineering, robotic fabrication, and digital computation, and creating an integrated transdisciplinary system that can enable us to design living buildings. The three research agendas have three separate outputs. The first is an engineered living material. The inspiration for the engineered living material comes from stromatolites, which are naturally growing biomineralized rock-like formations made by photosynthetic cyanobacteria communities. And it is known that the process of biomineralization in these stromatolites is linked to the production of extracellular carbonic anhydrase that catalyzes the precipitation of calcium carbonate. But the biggest challenge was that in nature they grow one microbiofilm layer at a time and therefore takes hundreds of years to grow. We therefore hypothesized an alternative process based on tissue engineering techniques. We tested the growth of cyanobacteria in a range of different hydrogel compositions that are typically used as scaffolds for growing artificial tissues. And a significant breakthrough was made by devising a composition that allowed the cyanobacteria biofilm to grow in a three-dimensional matrix. By using appropriate aggregates and nutrient media, we were able to grow a translucent biomineralized living material within a span of weeks. We have tested this material under ambient conditions and have found the biofilm to be viable even after a period of 180 days. This means that this living material is regenerative and photosynthetically active. And preliminary data shows that it can sequester around 1000 ppm of CO2 over a 28-day growth period. At the same time, this material is hardened by biogenic calcium carbonate and has a capacity of 6 to 7 megapascals, which is similar to the compressive strength of a conventional brick. We then tested various scale-up production methods of this material. First, by digitally generating a mold and casting the ELM top-down, but also a bottom-up process of growing the ELM naturally, photogrammetrically reconstructing and modifying it based on the application scenario, and robotically carving the material into a desired shape. Simultaneously, we developed Python-based custom computer vision programs to evaluate its growth, monitor its health, and extract relevant data for design and application. Finally, we were able to successfully grow a large 1:1 scale architectural panel of size 2 feet by 1 feet within a period of just 6 weeks. This novel translucent engineered living material therefore presents the opportunity of a new regenerative biomineralized carbon negative architecture. However, to truly arrive at a living architectural structure, we require a whole system of intelligent biomaterial fabrication, which is presented in the next chapter.
What is really fascinating about what Prantar has done is that it's not only the first material where we use photosynthesis, but it's the fact that he's now in Devon, here in the southwest of the UK, working in a farm to start doing the first production of this material. And if you think that an architectural material is not is not created and manufactured in an industry, but it's actually going to be produced in a farm, that is really interesting. So what we have done is robotically sort of manipulated the surface of the material, and we have installed it in a little construction we have done, a small-scale building in St. Andrews Botanic Gardens, where you can see here on the left-hand side some of the panels, where for the first time they are installed, integrated in, and actually exposed to the outer weather in order to understand and test it, how it exactly is responding. In the lab, everything has worked well, but as we know, once the material's outdoors, there are other phenomena and other aspects that kick in. We have done this design in a way also to express and explore these low-tech, high-tech aspects of architecture. This is a very fast construction, was all CNC cut and assembled as a temporary pavilion. And the interesting thing is that initially we wanted to put the panels outside to clad the pavilion with the ELMs. But because they couldn't be directly exposed to the rainfall straight away, we needed to do it the other way around. So we took basically the structure, we brought the structure outside, gave it an expressive quality, and cladded the building inside. Now, the other point we have been looking at in terms of materials that really matters is the circular economy of materials. Here we worked with the sugar company Tate & Lyle, and they told us that in their process of sugar refinement, they produce large quantities of waste. And this waste is mostly calcium carbonate. And they tried to use it in different materials and different conditions, but it doesn't somehow work. And therefore, they gave us quite a bit of this material. We investigated this material, mixed it with different binders. And actually, at the end, we managed to have a robotic extrusion process and created these lamella as a sort of proto-architectural condition to understand how deep could we go in order to create a maximization of the surface area that potentially could work for acoustic purposes or for thermal purposes. And that's what our colleagues in engineering are currently interested in. And we are taking this project further in order to understand how we can actually use this for a very important performative aspect that has to do with this control of acoustics and the thermal aspects inside spaces. As it often happens, you do a piece of work and then you realize that there is another property that is becoming even more interesting, which is that this material is very hydrophilic. And that is that it actually absorbs moisture in a passive way really well and releases it. So in spaces where you have a lot of moisture or a lot of crowds, it's actually a great material to regulate the moisture content in the air. And here you can see it for the exhibition Waste Age, which was a very important exhibition at the Design Museum 2 years ago, where we designed this big wall to make a bit of a statement that a waste material from the sugar industry could be reutilized in something that could be a future material for the indoors and architecture. So as you can see, I'm very interested in rethinking what the notion of surface, the notion of skin means. How can we design our context in a manner that engage the environment in a very different way? This was actually a piece that we did for the Archilab exhibition in 2013. This goes back now more than 10 years ago. And in fact, it was considered a wall for the outside, where we wanted it to gradually weather and have growth in the in-between spaces that you can see there, and all these sort of cells that we had parametrically sort of put together and designed. It was never put outside because the FRAC, the Institute of Architects in France, they decided to purchase it for their collection and ended up having it always indoors. But the logic remains, and that's what we continue working on. So I spoke about runoffs and the notion of irrigation. In this case, we designed with Shneel Malik She was actually leading this project. This installation called Indus was highly publicized, and in fact, she gave a big talk at the TEDx in Mumbai, where she spoke about the importance of this for the dye industry in India, where dirty, polluted water runs over the surface, and the algae, the immobilized algae in the hydrogel, has the capacity of an uptake of these heavy metals from the pollutants and keep it inside the material matrix. And the water that comes down at the end is actually less polluted water. So the idea that this is designed as a machine, but it's not a machine. It's a biotechnological device that also has this ornamental quality where the irrigation in itself creates these venations of water. As you well know, and that was part of the discussion, we're interested in cultural aspects. And partly the design was influenced by the peacock design in the Jaipur Royal Palace, which I had visited some years before. And we spoke a lot about how we design this machinic system in a way that it's not a machine. It's not a cleaning device. It's something that works naturally. It works with the type of water, the amount of water. And that is, here you sort of actually have a second version. That is for us much more important. And the uptake, by the way, then is saturating the material, and at some point it has to be cleaned away. In fact, the amount of heavy metals can be then recycled by certain industries. We have focused a lot on water typologies. We have looked a lot at how do we not only retain water, but what do we do with water when it's available? And there are two components or spaces that for us matter a lot in Western tradition, which is the gargoyle in old Gothic cathedrals as a point by which the water comes from the roof and is projected out of the building, and the notion of the grotto. The grotto comes from the Renaissance up to the 19th century, where you have a space which is a bit sort of the dark negative space of the open gardens, where there is a lot of moisture and a lot of growth happening. And we designed this piece as a sort of vertical gargoyle for an exhibition in Hamburg that just finished, and it's now going to Zurich, to the Museum of Applied Arts. And the idea was to bring water that comes from the roof and is running down and is going to do the bioremediation of the pollutants that we have in the air that then are absorbed and decomposed by the growth that is happening. This was a very fast process. And I finished the talk by saying that I think the most important thing is to design for aging buildings. We can't design for new ones. And what you're seeing here is a little shot that I did just of a building designed by Álvaro Siza and Eduardo Soto de Moura, the two Portuguese architects, when they designed the pavilion for the Hanover Fair. And the whole building was cladded with cork, extruded cork. And they rebuilt this pavilion in Hanover. They dismantled it and then rebuilt it in the center of Portugal. And it's fascinating to see how in a very short period of time, this building became very, very covered with a lot of lichen species. So what you saw in this film is the first part had no lichens, no growth at all, because it has an orientation where there are winds and the sun just basically dries out the entire surface, so nothing is growing. And then on this north-facing facade, we have what then at the end looks like this. I'm sure that Siza and Soto de Moura, they hate this. They just believe that they haven't cleaned the building properly. But the reality is that this building is alive. This building is aging in a beautiful way. Cork is a very resilient material. So the cork won't be affected because these species don't even have roots. And the water retention is very minimal. But what we are creating here is a great vertical garden that was unintentional. Now, if we start designing with the purpose that buildings are aging, so rather than focusing on the day where the opening of the building is happening, we have a big celebration and we dash off and never look at the building ever again. if we start thinking of what will be the building in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, how is there going to be an evolution of this in a positive way? Then we clearly have to rethink. And I have been spending quite a bit of time thinking of how the geometries that we use, and there is something about not being necessarily figural or figurative, but more figural and using geometries that are readable. We need to have forms that are readable so that if they become grown and if there's patchiness on them, we still have a sense of readability. And here we install these panels for the first time actually on a building in Scotland, and we are monitoring now how they gradually in time, this was actually quite recently, how they in time will be covered with lichens and mosses. And it just will be a process where we have absolutely no control over. As you can see, I'm very interested in a sense of vision also. What does it mean if we have these materials? What does it mean if we don't use concrete or we don't use steel, but we start using ELMs? What can we do with them? How do we fabricate them? And this is actually a little animation that a student of ours, Daniel Wen, did. He was working with Prantar Tamuli with the ELMs. And I think it's quite fascinating to see how these geometries are quite extraordinary. And here there's another little animation of another group of students who have worked in Taipei. They also worked with a material that is highly absorbent and where you have not a manicured landscape, but gradually a rewilding of the entire space. And I will finish with, this is a selected articles that we have written where we talk about these topics. You can see there in the middle, designing for aging buildings and applied research for poikilohydric living walls. That's a very important article that describes a lot of these phenomena. And here's some references of Studio Biocene and the March and the MSc Biointegrated Design. And I finished with this little animation of some other students, which I still really like, and talk a bit about this vision that we have. Thank you so much for listening. My message is just one. It's really important to work, first of all, with, I think, academia. There's a lot of knowledge that different institutes have currently. And there is a lot of a need in academia to apply the knowledge that has been developed. So that's one thing. The other thing is that really what we are doing needs a big shift. I mean, if the building industry or the build environment is going to double in the next 30 to 50 years, my goodness, if we continue building with how we are building, we are going to collapse for sure. Hence, there is no other way. We just have to rethink. And this makes me very anxious, I have to admit. It makes me nervous to think that there's a lot of business as usual. And the reality is we cannot continue building as we have been doing. So we just have to figure out another way. So the materials are coming, they're happening, they're starting to happen. So the more that there's an effort of shifting materials, reusing them in a different way, and thinking how this actually creates a different architecture, I think that is incredibly important, really interesting and important. It's a great opportunity, by the way. I think it's an opportunity for a new era that we are going to be part of. I don't know if there's any question, if anybody wants to ask a question. Prantar's ELM that he's working out in the farm, he has investors. This is a startup he has. It's just happening. So it's a matter of another year or two, and there will be the production. It will be rolling, and we will know what they cost. The cost can't be that high simply because the ingredients are quite cheap. Cyanobacteria is very cheap. It grows everywhere, right? And then there is a bit of hydrogel and some other stuff. Actually, it's not a complex process. Materials that have porosity have actually less material, so they're also cheaper. So that is something important to consider. So natural materials are cheaper. They're just more expensive currently because the industries are trying to exploit the moment because they're actually more available. It's material and stuff that is around. It's much easier and cheaper. So it's a matter of time. And I think it's a matter of pressure that we have to make on making sure that the industries that are going to produce these materials are going to sell them in a really available, cheap manner. You, by the way, you look in an amazing setting. I'm jealous. It looks incredible where you're sitting. What a beautiful, amazing place. Okay. Thank you all. Bye-bye.